Chris Christie has certainly burned the boats, right?
Fun fact, the burn the boats comes from Hernan Cortez and the invasion of the Aztec Empire. I believe historians now think he actually scuttled the ships, but then the legend became that they were burned, but that they just sort of sunk them instead of trying to burn them. But I was thinking about this also yesterday because you mentioned the burn the boats thing, and we had people writing in about my claim that that Hannibal was one of the 5 greatest generals of all time. I also mentioned Napoleon, and someone wrote in Genghis Khan. And I'm like, there's some strong feelings out there about most impressive military commander. In the case of the Khanate and Genghis Khan in particular, you're talking about, mass destruction of not just armies but civilians on a scale that had never been seen before in human history. So that's a tough one.
Isn't Genghis Khan there's some insane percentage of his DNA that exists in much of that region of the world still? Is it as much as 1 in 16 people are descended from Genghis Khan in some way?
This I do not know. I've heard something along those lines, but I don't know if that's true.
It's some unbelievable number of children that he individually and his family, obviously, his heirs, have fathered throughout the course of that region. I think it was 1 in 16 in some parts of the world. Can directly trace their descent to Genghis Khan, which is kind of unbelievable to think about.
I also think if you're talking about the greatest generals of all time, you do have to make a separation into those who were forward deployed combatants themselves versus those who were strategic geniuses a little bit. You start to get into, Alexander the Great was part of cavalry charges, right? And he would actually get into it.
Yeah, no, actually, you got me thinking now, too. Who is the greatest American general of all time?
Oh, this audience will get our VIPs on email because we're not going to have time for all the calls on this. Send us the greatest American general of all time.
Who would you argue?
I think you'd get a lot of people who would say, based on results, Douglas MacArthur has to be high on the list.
Yeah.
I think people would argue that. Now, others would say that that's crazy, but there are definitely going to be some Douglas MacArthur people in the audience. On a skills basis, you're going to get some people who say that for outcome on the battlefield, Robert E. Lee was an incredible strategic mind for his time. That is a fact of military history. They will say that. You could. No one's saying here. We're just talking about how good someone is at generalship. Who comes to mind for you from the American side?
Well, it's going to be even more controversial because I think and again, also the possibility is: are you talking about commanding general or someone who had a corps or someone who had a division I'll give you a couple from the Civil War. Nathan Bedford Forrest, to me, is probably the greatest cavalry general that ever existed in maybe the world. And there's some interesting stories, Buck. And again, just talking military genius, if you look at the way that Forrest fought his battles, they're incredible. And one of the people who was most impressed by Forrest, reportedly, was Rommel, who traveled pre-World War II. You study military history.
I was about to bring up that, Rommel wasn't, Nazi fighting World War II, but in terms of military, strategic, and tactical prowess, a lot of military historians would say Rommel was one of the great military tacticians of all time.
And that he came here and studied and walked the battlefields of Nathan Bedford Forrest to try to understand the strategies that he deployed. Because if you see the topography, if you are a military historian, anybody who studies history, the topography of a battlefield was hugely important historically to who won and who lost.
And I mentioned Hernan Cortez at the beginning and the conquest of the Aztec Empire. He arrived with hundreds of men and managed to defeat an empire that had human sacrifice and slavery, by the way, but the Aztec Empire, massive slave empire, actually, you don't hear about that, but defeated them, and I think they estimate a couple million people. He managed to just, it's an incredible story. You could make an amazing television series about Cortez and the Aztecs, but it would be very controversial because he was a rough dude. There's no question about it.
We've got some Genghis Khan updates. Let me also give you a couple more Civil War generals because people are going to be like, Clay Travis praises, Clay Travis and Buck Sexton praise Robert E. Lee. And,
you're on your. I said Robert E. Lee. I was going to say you're on your own.
Nathan
Civil
Bedford
War,
Forrest, who had a checkered at best past after the Civil War. I would say George Thomas, who was a Virginian who stayed loyal to the North. If you look at what he did in the Western theater, saved the Union Army at Chickamauga, and then later basically wiped out Hood in the Battle of Nashville. One of the most successful Union generals that's probably under the radar. And then the other one I would point to, and again, it goes to not only the strategic genius, but being forward-thinking enough to even try it, Sherman. The idea when Sherman decided to begin his march to the sea, that his army could forage off of the land without supply chains was a revolutionary idea. And obviously Sherman's ability to basically fight the will of the Southern people to continue that war. You know who's not a great general? If you actually, and I'm going to get people fired up here too.
Are you throwing Grant under the bus here?
No, I actually think Grant. I was going to say George Washington. If you look at George Washington's actual military exploits,
George kept the army together during very tough times. You bite your tongue with that George talk.
You go look at George Washington on the battlefield, as opposed to certainly he was a genius at managing and maintaining the revolution. But in terms of his on-the-battlefield performance, not that good of a performance.
But he was an insurgent, and insurgents just have to outlast the will of the enemy, which is what he did. Okay, we have some Genghis updates, and also if you want to wait, now we started the greatest generals. We have a lot of news to get to. I promise we'll get to that too. But 800-282-2882, we got the military historians. Some of them, especially Clay with your Civil War takes. Someone's going to yell at us.
I think my Civil War takes are going to be respected by Civil War people, but it's going to be a headline on one of these left-wing sites that I said something positive about a Confederate general. How dare I?
I'll balance it for the left-wingers by saying that Zhukov in the second, Soviet Zhukov in the Second World War was a very effective general and tactician in the Soviet sense, which means, lose as many lives as you have to get the job done.
And by the way, Stonewall Jackson, genius. I should have obviously mentioned him, but he obviously is very well known. Yeah. Sorry. I'm fired up here. Yeah.